These ones.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Since we are in the home stretch and we don't want to keep you all here into the evening without, say, a glass of wine in your hands, we're going to move forward and plow through the last session of the program. I think this has been an absolutely terrific 2 days, and I'd like to take a moment before we move on to our final session to just congratulate all of the organizers and the committee who've helped put this meeting together. I think it's been fantastic, and let's owe them a round of applause. And in particular, I think we should thank our kind hosts at the Wellcome Trust. I think they've done a fantastic job. This last panel is actually going to be talking about non-traditional assessments or alternative metrics from the perspective outside of our own, outside of the traditional academic sphere. And I think there's a tremendous amount of really interesting things happening outside of the academic world in terms of data analytics and social media reference and use and analytics. So really interested to hear from our next two speakers. Our first is Bobby Duffy, who is Managing Director of Ipsos. Did I have that correct? Ipsos. Mori Social Research Institute. And he's going to be talking about the social media and market research work that he does. So your slides are up.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well done, everyone, for making it this far in a two-day session. I'm going to, as it says, social media analysis for social and market research, really. And just to start with managing expectations, because I've sort of seen the program and how detailed and technical the analysis is that you've been talking about. But ours is, what we're doing, I think, is, as Ipsos Mori, is not really that special, unusual or special in terms of social media analysis. But I think, hopefully, what it does is illustrate some of the issues faced when you're using this in a broader context. And then, sort of more recently, how we're trying to develop approaches to social media research that, crucially, I think from our perspective, puts this as a new data stream in researchers' control instead of in black boxes, actually, for us to mess around with ourselves. So, first of all, a little bit about Ipsos Mori. I just wanted to know it's an international audience, but a quick show of hands of who've heard of Ipsos Mori. Oh, that's good. The more people who show their hands, the less I have to say about the organisation, which is good from your perspective. So basically, we are quite a broad range of types of research specialism. So public affairs, which is the bit that I'm in charge of, is mostly about social research and social and political research. But then we've also got a loyalty practice that looks at customer satisfaction, a media practice, marketing and advertising. So we've got all these different measures of impact that we're trying to do in different types of contexts. So we're probably best known for political opinion polling for among at least the British audience. That's what we mostly do, and that sits within my bit. But just a quick guess from anyone about how much of our work is actually the political opinion polling that you'd see in the media? 8%. That's really precise and a good guess. Have you seen our accounts or no? Good. Anyone else? 7. Whoa! I'm getting a feel for the audience. They were actually. I've been even more precise. I've taken it to 2 decimal points. So it's actually 0.16% of our work by revenue. So it's a tiny, tiny bit of what we do. Most of what we do is measuring the impact of policy programs or private sector activities. And market research itself, the overall industry is a very traditional one in some ways. We've got these types of methods that we've used over a large number of years from, the kind of question asking. They're mostly question asking approaches of different sorts, either in groups or individually with people. But increasingly over the last few years, we've been using other types of data. So neuroscience is quite big in lots of the work that we do. And but also passive data, looking at big data and how people behave, actually measuring that directly rather than asking people questions. And social media analysis has kind of fitted into that, and that's a bit that I'm going to talk about today. So the traditional social media analysis approach is very much along these lines, where you've got define the search term, but you've got what's in and out in particular. Then you've got define the base, so just actually working out who you're trying to get hold of in terms of different types of population definitions in some ways. And then you move on to the dashboard metrics. This is how it typically works, and you're looking at different types of measures within that you can define in various ways and filter in different ways. And then you've got site-specific measures, so you can drill down into particular forms of social media, particular sources of it, or particular subgroups within it, and look at those in different sorts of ways. And finally, you've got the manual coding aspect of it, which is still quite a key part of what you do when we're doing this kind of traditional approach to social media analysis in our sort of context. So that manual verification, but also taking some of the qualitative depth from it, quite important. And you can get some useful outputs with this. We did a massive study for the Department of Business here in the UK, and over a year, looking at all sorts of aspects of attitudes to science, and you can get these sorts of patterns from it for just seeing what people are talking about over the course of a year in science and science-related topics. So it's quite useful to be able to see how people develop. So meteors, there was a lot of discussion, a relative amount of discussion about meteors early on in 2013, and then a big peak around the horse meat scandal, which then went away and then came back again, if you remember. And you can kind of track that in social media terms. And then measles came up. You had a little section where it was talking very much about measles. Then we had a bit about GM food. Then we had fracking, not so much interest in fracking, that was kind of bubbling along in social media space. Then a big thing around the IPCC report on climate change. There was a big peak in people talking about that. And then towards the end of the year, you had people talking about animal research. And then this one, the one in purple, I won't try to get you to guess this because it's kind of it's tangentially related to science in many ways. But actually, those two big purple peaks were, well, badger culls. So that was a big section. This is a badger culling season in there and there. And actually, just this is a complete aside, nothing really related to social media analysis. We also twice a year run a survey of MPs where we're asking them what's the most important issues to them, etc., etc. We also ask them what do their constituents write to them about the most. Anyone can guess what's the topic that MPs get most letters from the public on?
They're expensive.
Yeah, it's amazing how they don't get that anymore. It's gone in people's minds. Sorry? Dustbins, yeah, local services don't come up. Sorry? Potholes, no, not so much. It's more a local thing that people complain about. It's immigration. So it's the top issue nationally. It's the top thing that people write to their MPs about. Then you get things like benefits, housing service. But then actually number 5 is badger culls. So it's the 5th most written about topic to MPs over the course of a year. And then you look down, you've also got animal research and then hunting with dogs as well. So it is something that people feel passionate about. You can see that in the social metrics as well, social media metrics too. Then we do other much more in-depth things, much more specific, how particular audiences discuss particular issues. So for a big children's charity, we looked at child abuse and how different professional groups and other groups, campaigning groups, talked about child abuse and just different ways, looking at the top tweets that people were saying about it and see who the influencing groups were within there, what were the influential topics. So you can dive down into looking at those types of things. And then you can we segmented the sample into different types of organizations and then look at the different sorts of terms and the different ways that they talk about child abuse. So you can kind of do some quite detailed textual analysis, obviously, of how different groups talk about the issues in different ways. So this is a sample where using the term abuse, very different usage of that as a term among these different particular sample groups, and you kind of drill down into what people were talking about that. It was mostly about getting advice about how to deal with it. So that gives them quite a good understanding of how their support groups and client groups are using social media to actually get support on these types of things. And then what they were particularly interested in was the networks of influence. So you can kind of use other tools within social media metrics that start to map those spheres of influence and who are the most influential people or groups within a particular topic. So you get these type of maps that you'll have seen of who's connected to who, who's retweeting who thinks. So that's the charity itself, very big charity. And the next most important organisation within this is actually the education department here in the UK. So they've also got a very strong network, but it allowed them to really more systematically understand who were the individual influencers of opinion, or who were the key people that were pushing out information in different ways among their target groups that we've defined with them. So you get these kind of influential nodes of people showing through quite clearly from this type of analysis. But a lot of what we do is actually event-based. So we do that detailed work, but then we do a lot of event-based things, because a lot of our work, particularly in the political sphere, is event-based. So the most recent thing we've done, actually, last week we were at the party conferences. Last week, no, this week. I lost track of time. This week we were at a Labour Party conference and we had Ed Miliband's speech. Did anyone see the speech? No. Yeah, this is very representative of the public. No, very few people did see the speech. Those who did were pretty underwhelmed, mostly. You heard it. Yeah, it was 80 minutes of speech, which is yes. I did a session with Phil Collins, who at the Times, who used to be speechwriters for Labour, and it was he was scathing about it. But we were doing the about the length and everything else. But we were doing the social media analysis live at the party conference with people in like little sessions, and it was kind of that aspect of it is really useful for our type of work. You get that live reaction from an unusual audience, as to be said, but still useful. So there's 36,000. An odd tweet about the speech, or that could be identified to be related to the speech, from 12,000 unique voices. So there was a reason for that clustering concentration, but not too much. There was quite a lot of that across different people. Then you can start to do the mapping aspects of the geolocation aspects of some elements of it. So this is just the map that shows the map itself, not massively helpful, but when you drill down into it, the interesting thing, the probably relevant thing for this, was only 745 tweets from Scotland about the whole speech. So you can kind of, from a Scottish Labour point of view, that was quite important to recognise that, you know, massively underrepresented in connection to Ed's speech, which is useful to know and probably chimes with how they're feeling in Scottish Labour right now. And then obviously you can track things and classify. This tool that we're developing allows you to do classifiers on different types of things. So this is a classifier around whether something was related to one of the 6 promises that Ed had made. So you can promise related or not promise related, and the promises came in quite late, and it was a lot of, this is your 60 minutes of not much going on at the beginning, and then a few minutes of promise related stuff. So you can kind of start to classify what people are talking about by subject, as well as just sentiment and those types of things. And this is a bit more detail on those types of promises, and there's actually that big peak where people actually got interested. And this was very useful for them. There's actually quite dry stuff around devolution, constitutional change, and votes for 16 to 17-year-olds was actually the thing that kind of fired up lots of interest in social media. Well, that's what people tended to be discussing. But the interesting thing, again, from their perspective, is you can look at that by party, because we were able to identify party sympathy beforehand from the different Twitter users, but some of them for a sample of them at least. And it was actually, the blue line is conservative. It was actually conservative supporters that were talking most by far about those constitutional reforms. So not often in a positive terms, as you can imagine. So it's actually less interest in Labour sympathisers themselves at that point. So you can try to get those types of things in more or less real-time analysis of what's coming out for people. And then finally, we did do the sentiment analysis. You tend to do that on all these types of things. And as you can see, the orange is negative. That's Ed Ballsey's speech the day before, so he's a lot smaller and a lot more negative, as you might imagine, for a shadow chancellor's speech. But actually, so then you've got about a quarter of tweets were actually positive 3/4 were negative, according to the sentiment analysis that we did on that. We also did, sorry about the image, we've done lots of these around different types of speeches and event-based things. So this was the Farage-Clegg debate, which we did something very similar, because when you start to see that sentiment aspect of 3/4 being negative, you start to wonder what does good look like in these types of analysis, given that Twitter is notoriously negative about things. So so for the Farage-Clegg debate, it was actually 8 times as many negative than positive tweets that you could get, that you could actually assign sentiment to. And again, using the classifiers, different sorts of classifiers across different types of things, it was actually 72% about personality, and only 22% that could be assigned to a particular policy or relevant thing that they were talking about. And that's that kind of trail there. You can see actually what were people talking about at different points. Were they policy-related points about differences between the two men, or was it just about the personality differences between the two men? And obviously you have the fun of pulling out different individual tweets, which was quite florid language in for Farage and Clegg. Weapons-grade douche knuckle is one of my favourite descriptors of a politician that I've seen, and that's just a grim image of quite a grim debate in many ways. But there's lots of challenges and limitations, as you can imagine, as you know better than me, probably a lot of you. But some of the things is that point of calibration. What does good look like when you're starting to look at these types of things? And understanding that, what you're trying to achieve, very important for us. The sampling issues, obviously, sample frames are very difficult. Mostly what we do is trying to define populations and work out ways to do sampling. That's our day-to-day thing. So that sampling aspect very important. The limited profile information is related to that. It's very difficult to do good balanced sampling when you've got that limited profile information that you have for Twitter. The quality of the data itself, the tools, it's the way that the searches work in traditional tools is quite difficult to deal with, and you're kind of stuck with something that's quite inflexible. And then the analysis is difficult. All these different tools, it's trying to get it together. You kind of have to use all sorts of different things in order to get a comprehensive view of insight from the data that you've got. And then the ethical aspect of it, the guidance on ethical aspects, I'll come back to in a sec, just at the end. But yeah, it's very, very little on that. And then the representativeness is obviously an issue overall when you're talking about social media. And I'm focusing on Twitter just for this bit here, because Twitter is a bit weird, and we kind of we know that from again the Ed speech. Did you see the Gareth line? So Ed met someone called Gareth in a park, and then spent ages talking about this interaction with Ed, and then Twitter. Then Gareth was trending everywhere, and everyone was doing things like this of I found Gareth. So it's weird in terms of content and how people react, which is a bit interesting too. But it's also very weird in terms of who's on it and profile population, those types of things. So this is, we do a tech tracker thing every quarter where we measure who's on different social media, in this case, lots of other aspects of technology. And you can see it's actually, for Twitter in the grey, it's going up a bit, but not massively, and there's still only 18% of the population who use Twitter regularly in 3 months, so it's a small proportion of the population, 1 in 5, a bit less. But it's also a weird population. It's kind of, obviously, it's a little bit more male, it's a lot younger, it's a lot more middle class than working class, and then it's a lot of people that are already into technology in some other sort of form. So it's an unusual population, and when you interact, when you cross some of those factors, you get charts like this. So this is looking at sex, age, and social class together, and just looking at the penetration for males and females in different social groups, and then by age across. And you can see as further you get to your right and bottom side, you've got very, very few people interacting with these social media in those groups, and that's important. So if there's anyone in here who's 65 plus and regularly tweets or even interacts, and that's very unusual, particularly if you're in manual social classes. You're in a very rare bit of the population, so it's very concentrated still in that younger, which is really important in our type of work for understanding the impact of communications and the impact of messages from people is who you're actually talking to. There's a real sense of Westminster bubble extending into social media bubble in many ways. And we've been doing a lot of generational analysis recently in different sorts of contexts to see how things are changing generationally. It's very important the way that, because technology moves so fast. But one of the interesting patterns I was a bit surprised about is how actually social media penetration seems to be flattening out generationally. So you've got, this is pre-war people in dark blue. At the bottom, that's everyone born before 1945 or before. And it's not age, it's generation, so it's everyone born on those days, and then it follows through that group. So they're basically untouched by social media, and they're not going to, they're going to die out before they actually get too much involved. Then you've got baby boomers, so it's 1945, 1965, that sort of group, and a bit higher, but pretty flat to Generation X, 65 to 79, that sort of age group, born in 65 to 1979, that sort of age group, and you can see that's gone up, but then flattened too. And then even Generation Y, the youngest generation, born since 1980, similar sort of pattern, but it's flattening. So you're reaching kind of maximum penetration within generation on some of these measures, which I was a bit surprised that we're reaching that quite so soon. So the actual increase that you're seeing in that early slide in Twitter use is actually to do with generational replacement, not to do, so older generations dying out, being replaced by younger generations, rather than uptake within generation. So it's kind of the extent to which this ever extends into something that's completely representative or more representative of people is still a moot question when you start to see these type of generational patterns. Another challenge is obviously just the data itself and the limitations to the searches that you can do, and then how you use the data. So we were doing something for IPCC, so the Intergovernmental or the Climate Change Group, and looking at lots of different clusters of issues around that. And then you get, obviously, this is something that we've all come across in this, you get little clusters when you start to see sex and force and commission, and then you obviously realise that there's another IPCC, which is the Independent Police Complaints Commission, who were covering this story, which is much more about police officer reinstated because sex on duty is like a tea break. So you kind of, it's filtering out those types of, that's a very crude example of these types, but all the time it's that concerns contamination of what you're measuring. And challenge of identifying public opinion, because that's quite a lot of what we're doing in communications terms. Sometimes it's specific audiences, but quite often it's public opinion. And trying to identify that public opinion isn't easy either, because you've got traditional media having a heavy voice in social media. And so this is the type of pattern around climate change, where you're looking at the September to December period. So you've got quite a bit of Twitter, but then a lot of traditional media impact on that, and you can see that in lots of different ways. Big influence on the conversation. And the interesting thing from a science point of view for the biz work, the Department of Business work, was it varies so much between different issues. What's the relative weight of traditional media and people talking among themselves on social media? So issues like badger culls, which are a genuine passion for individuals, very much more them talking among themselves. Same with animal testing, and lots of other things are kind of news-driven issues. So understanding that type of difference, really important and quite difficult to unpick sometimes. And the final challenge is obviously automating sentiment. You'll have seen lots on this. This is what the machine learning, the NLP, would say is the sentiment for this particular thing around, I think this was around climate change too. We recoded it manually, the 200, and that's the sort of sentiment you get. And so 55% accuracy, and this is, on a standard tool, 55% accuracy of sentiment, and it's the same issues that you see throughout of not being able to understand sarcasm and the subtleties of how people use language, and that's still an issue. It's always going to be an issue, an ongoing issue, for trying to use this in a coherent, systematic way. So finally from me then, what we're trying to do is develop a slightly different approach to it. We've got a technology strategy board bid that that's just been approved, and we're working through now with it's us and University of Sussex and Demos, the CHASM, the Centre for Analysis of Social Media at Demos. So it's a group of us trying to look at this from a commercial and social research perspective, and how do you actually make this more useful, get over some of these issues for the types of research that we do. There's lots of differences in how we're going to approach it, try lots and lots of different things in some ways. So in terms of, particularly in terms of how the search is done in a much more manipulable way from our perspective, an iterative way rather than having a set term at the beginning and then following that through and rechecking it. But I guess, I mean, the key thing from our perspective is a lot of this ends up being black box. A lot of the existing approaches end up being quite black box, and you don't know what's happening to the data, and it kind of churns out the other end in our type of world. And what we're trying to do is actually get the researchers to own the data themselves. More and more, this has got to be just another stream of data that social and market researchers can use in order to understand impact in different ways. And that's what the basis of the tool will be, doing lots of different things, mostly improving the insights in terms of being able to get better demographic things, and trying to be more open and honest about the credibility of the research by measuring and testing. We're doing a whole series of things, testing online, offline approaches to see whether we can end up with things like weighting approaches that allow us to say with some confidence what it's representative of and generalized to different populations. And then finally, the ethical point, as I said, it's an area where it's actually not been looked at very much from a market research. Again, traditional industry, very slow at looking at these types of things. And actually, that ethical point, we're going to be doing lots of work with, in a deliberative sense, with the general public about their trust in data usage for these types of approaches, but then also working out our own guidelines on how you can do these types of things ethically. Thank you.
For maybe one or two questions. All right, thank you.
No worries.
Never knew there was such an interest in badgers.
No. Thank you. And let's see. Yep. Did I do that the right way? Always a worry. Our final speaker is Tim Barker, who is the Chief Product Officer of DataSift, the world's largest provider of social data to brand agencies and analytics.
Hi everyone. I should start by saying no badges were harmed. My presentation. And I know you've had 2 days of going deep on research. Some of the content I'll skim through. You would have covered it before. So just look at this as the final ascent upwards as you've been deep. You know, I'll try not to give you the bends on the way up, and we'll just sort of surface and end the conference. So just a little bit of perspective. You've probably not heard of DataSift. DataSift is a technology company. We partner with social networks. We consume their full set of public data, we expand it, enrich it, and then we allow companies to tap into that. So companies like Altmetrics are a customer of ours, and we work, although a lot of time has been spent talking about Twitter, we deal with about 25 different companies. So we're the bridge. All the big data starts with us, and we can allow you to tap into that to really extract data for analysis. And so today, what I was asked to talk about is how, outside of academic research, companies are trying to solve some of the problems that our last speaker spoke about. And I thought I would just pick perhaps 3 use cases in order to be able to do that. So you don't need me to tell you that the world changed. You know, you've probably all seen this photo. This was the after the Pope's inauguration. A brief number of years, you can see how much we've all been connected as part of that. You know, we can't live without our phones now, and of course, whether they're iPhone 6 or not, whether they're bent or not, we're all generating humongous amounts of data. So you'll know the stats, right? 3.2 billion likes a day, 500 million tweets a day. One of our partners is WordPress. WordPress may not jump to be front of mind to you, but it powers 22% of the world's websites. So a huge amount of content is being generated daily and commentary around that. And it's not just the visible content that people are publishing, but they're also we have partnerships with companies like Bitly that allows you to get a view of what people are consuming. Every click on that BBC article or the FT goes through their service. So you get about 300 million clicks a day registered. So this is all allowing you to really create a more observable, transparent, measurable social and digital universe. And it does come with challenges, as our last speaker mentioned. There are challenges around the demographic, the adoption of that, and the fact that the haters will hate, right? So you'll always draw a crowd if you've got a inflammatory topic. And so what I'll talk about is how some of our customers, like Kantar Research, part of WPP, try to address some of these challenges as they look to do consumer broad research along the way. As we all know, a tiny 140-character tweet is a nugget of data. We all know that these contain geo-encoded data. They contain data in the profile, so you can identify journalists from students, from CEOs, through how they've publicly posted. We also do a huge amount of big data processing to both anonymize and then enrich this type of data as well. So if you want, you can get a purely demographic or psychographic view of this, so you can start to look across professions, topics of interest. And I think that was something that came up in a previous session as well, is how do you kind of expand the demographic, but also preserve the identity? And so these are some of the challenges that you'll be pleased to know you're not alone in trying to address. And of course, the big issue that's faced with all this is how do you read data out of text? How do you turn it from big, fast, messy streams of data into relevant data that's ready for analysis? And we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that new innovations that companies are using and our customers are using to really make this work. But as we know, social started as a vanity metric. It started off with people looking to protect their brand, to look at people that were talking about #myproduct. And so, if you look at the brief history of this market, it started with monitoring, not analysis. It started with monitoring and responding. But the problem is, as we know, is you can't eyeball the internet. You can't eyeball every tweet, post, comment, and click to see and to read that at scale. And so, as a technology provider to this industry of thousands of companies that are trying to gulp down this huge fire hose and make sense of it, we often see people come in with this huge enthusiasm, this sort of new hope in a sort of Star Wars-esque style around what the potential might be. And there is unlimited potential. And it's interesting to see all of these companies, technology companies that we work with, building out their big data infrastructure, building out and installing their big Hadoop clusters so they can process all this data. But you know what? If you do really high precision, you don't really need that technology. A mention of one of the biggest brand mentions probably daily is something like Starbucks. It gets about 85,000 mentions a day. The biggest social media activity across the world every day is happy birthday. And so in between these two metrics, there's probably enough data for you to be able to find and research. So part of what we do is to try and reduce down and remove irrelevancy from this so you can actually focus on identifying and analyzing content that's relevant. So I thought what I would do is talk about just three things that we see in other industries are top of mind and the companies are trying to solve. Because it might sort of inspire you and it might cross-propagate from what people are doing in the highly commercial sector to how it might be relevant in yours. So the first one let's talk about is intent detection. So the last speaker spoke about this sentiment, and the issues of doing sentiment measurement. There's also the other challenge of what does it mean? What does 87% negative mean on something? It's not really easy to action. And of course, as we get more data available and we want to read and action that data, sentiment alone is a pretty blunt instrument. And in most analysis that you'll do, you'll find the majority of it is neutral as well. So what do we do then? And so some of the work that we do, we work with airlines. I'm sure most of you have vented your praise or frustration as you boarded that EasyJet flight or British Airways, and you got on board and you found out they didn't have any warm nuts. So all of these things are now social as a channel for us to really communicate with brands directly. And so if you were to look at sentiment, clearly it's going to give you a mixed view. Of course, what companies are now doing is really trying to read, from using a machine, really try and read intent. So one of the analysts in this space called Altmetrics Group, I'd recommend you take a look at their research. They publish it all as open source research as well. Kind of identified what they call the actionable internet mentions, 7 classes of conversation that you can use to either to analyze and route effectively or respond. So they're simple ones like a rant, a rave, a query, customer feedback, urgent request, or a lead. So if you start to overlay those, you can use machine learning. I'm not planning to go deep on that, but our customers, you can use support vector machines or decision trees and test the accuracy of that to really allow you to understand a domain systematically. So you can turn this red, green, amber into a better view of the world that allows you to go beyond measuring volumes and mentions into really understanding topics at scale. So here's an example taken out from the airline industry. So if you're American Airlines, you're presenting to your board and you're cheering because you got the most volume, you have the most social mentions. But of course, once you start to overlay different dimensions of this, it gives you a different perspective. Firstly, you can start to look at the actionable internet mentions. Secondly, you can then start to classify that by topic. What are people talking about? Is it the baggage? Is it the onboard Wi-Fi? Is it the customer service? And so it may be hard to read here, I'm sure it is, but you can start to see where you can start to read this data at scale. And so you can see that American Airlines has a huge urgent request around flight delays, or British Airways, ironically, lots of rants on customer service. So I guess one of the main things we're trying to do now across industry is turn the science from simple sentiment, do people love us or not, into really high precision intent detection. And of course, if you can start to look at that over a time series, you can start to see how you're influencing. So we worked with one of the agencies last year for those of you that have got kids that love gaming, last year the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 launched about the same time. So what they wanted to do was essentially track an audience through that journey, understand how their intent changed. Because if you're in PR, you're all about trying to influence the outcome. And so you could start to look at people that were definitely evaluating or considering or potentially on the fence. And you could chart that same group of people through a campaign to really understand what was the intent as that, or the mood of that as it evolved. Another company would be someone like Dell. They get about 38,000 mentions a day. And so what they do is they have essentially normalized that across their entire product line and across all of their product features. So they know if you're talking about a Dell laptop and you're talking about the screen or the battery life, and then they map that into a model that allows their product managers to have what they call a social net advocacy score, and they can start to track the topics in real time. And so they've used this to identify whether they need to reprice a product, or they need to enhance a feature, or they need to launch a campaign. And so essentially what you're seeing is companies moving from reading volume to reading signal out of this and trying to measure intent. One of the other challenges that there is this data representative? And I think our last speaker covered this much better than I could, but I can talk to a couple of ways that companies are trying to now at least model domains so they can try and come up with a representative data set. So one of our customers is YouGov, who, as you'll remember from the Scottish referendum vote, were kind of created a pivotal research as part of that. I should say that wasn't done from Twitter. But what they've done to try and address the issue of how do you create a representative data set is they've recruited a huge Twitter panel, representative, I think it's 65,000 people. So essentially what they can do is they can look at those peaks and spikes around badger culls, and they can compare that against what they view as a balanced representative data set. They're still going to be thin in certain demographics, but it's going to give you a way to balance that. And they use our technology to do that, because you can put a ring fence around 65,000 people and say, that's what I want to listen to. The other thing that we're doing is, of course, that requires a traditional research opt-in type program so that you can build a panel out of it. What we're also seeing is now companies using reading social data to really get a better understanding, or looking at the followers, people that follow a certain product, or people that follow a certain company, gives you basically a synthetic research panel. So here's an example of another one of our customers that can use, again in this case, Twitter research panels to identify what topics are over or under indexed. And so, for example, on a mainstream media story, you might read by creating research panels around what do the Daily Mail users think versus the Times versus the Sun, because you can essentially create little micro audiences that allow you to give different views into that data. So you know, social's definitely evolving from volume-based to panel-based, and that's a key thing that's going to help us really understand, are we looking at the echo chamber, or essentially are we seeing representative, you know, market feedback? And I guess the last piece, which I know has been covered briefly yesterday, is really around using it for the predictive power of social. And of course, in order to really be able to predict, you need to be able to blend a transaction and an interaction. So you need to be able to look at the two to see which is the driver. Is there a causation around this? So I just thought I'd spend a couple of minutes talking about some interesting examples of how companies are starting to do this. Because if you can use social as a predictor, obviously that can allow you to capture the opportunity. So one of my favorite stories is one of our customers in the US. In fact, if you were to tell this story of the UK, you tell it this way. How many shirts should the Premiership sponsors be printing with Wayne Rooney on the back? How popular is Wayne Rooney going to be in the next 3 or 4 months? Essentially, the way that you can measure that inventory is by listening to the roar of the crowd. And so in the US, one of the organizations that produces the football shirts uses this kind of simple mechanism to really identify player popularity, which of course is not simply based off of their on-field activity, but also off-field as well. So with this, they're able to gear their supply chain, their demand for each of these products based off of the social signals that they're seeing from it. And it's a similar thing that one of our customers in the UK, a large retailer, uses to predict demand for new products. They can identify how many bananas or barbecues they're going to need on any given day, but when a new DVD, film, or game comes out, they want to correlate past retail sales with Google search trend traffic with social to try and create a predictive. And the predictor is going to allow them to identify how heavily, what promotion they should put around this, or what placement should they have for it. In fact, one of our other customers in the movie production business uses this to really understand how much money do you spend on continually to advertise a film. We've all seen that where a film just gets traction and then you don't need to continue to spend to grow the audience. So there are other ones that just require that extra push. And so some of the work that we've done there is really to allow customers to blend data sets. So if you blend your box office revenues with the social activity across different social networks, you start to see an interesting picture. And that picture is way too small for you to read, so apologies around that. But there's definitely a correlation, and what's interesting is you see activity shift between different networks. Prior to a film's release, bulk of the activity is on Facebook. And that may be because there's a bulk of advertising going as well. Post-release, when the thing premieres, huge amount of activity spikes up on Instagram, because people are attending, talking, getting their selfies outside the cinema, perhaps. And so from this, you can start to create correlations and models that allow you to identify what's that tipping point when a film's got traction, or where is the audience now moving to before, during, or after that. So, you know, the ultimate goal of using social and social signals as a prediction is something that we're increasingly seeing companies do, to enable them to integrate and blend data sets. So it's, again, getting social out of its echo chamber and silo by bringing business data to it. And I guess, you know, in summary, you know, one of my favorite quotes from William Gibson is, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And I think what we're seeing is this market is in its nascent form. There are challenges around the robustness of data. There's challenges around the audience. But it goes back to that one of those kind of first slides we have around it's data that's never been available or visible before. And as other networks, you know, we've all started with Twitter because of the availability of the data. But I encourage you to look, as you look to create robust analysis, look at things like Bitly, which gives you a view into the world's, what the world's reading or paying attention to right now. Or even sites like Tumblr, which you'd be surprised at content on Tumblr has an incredibly long shelf life, because it is a content publishing platform plus a social network together. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what companies outside of academia are doing with it. And I guess I'll wrap up there. If anyone's got any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Okay. Yeah.
So I noticed from your over and underrepresented topics graph, it seemed that sports was very much up at the top. In the bottom, I saw things like recipes and home decorating, which makes me immediately wonder if you're looking at different platforms, say, you know, Twitter versus Pinterest. Do you have any way of like controlling for the gender differences in the platforms? Or
Yeah, so obviously our over and under indexing has to be compared against what normal looks like. So typically what you'll do is you'll take a X% sample of all activity or a sample of all activity on UK and then use that as the basis. So that the index graph that I just flicked through showed topics of interest for US dads. And so in order to get that, there's two things. One is a measurement of norm, and then there's the other thing, which is to be able to read topics of interest at scale. So one of the things that we do in our platform is what's called now traditionally known as deep learning. So basically allowing you to map into, take from a conversation, a tweet or a post, map that into one of 650,000 topics. So I think it kind of fits with the general trend that people are going from measuring volumes and now trying to understand audiences. But over and under indexing is really just how it compares to a standard that you're going to set. And that again is one of the challenges that the industry faces. People that I meet in marketing get all excited that they've got 12,000 likes for a campaign. But what does that mean? What is a benchmark for success? Thanks. Hi there.
I'm grateful for machine learning. I'm able to apply any sort of error bar on it. So you could say, well, such and such is this plus or minus.
Yes, we are. I mean, essentially the way, and again, the last speaker spoke about sentiment and how machines and people compare. The reality of it is that you can never get 3 people to agree if you gave them 100 pieces of content to rank which ones are positive, neutral, or negative. So typically the way that this is being developed by companies is through effectively starting by creating training data. So where you manually go through and code, let's say 1,000 items and classify them, then apply what's called a grid search to attack that data using a number of different algorithms, and then make a recommendation on the one that's going to have the highest precision and recall. So what it can do is it can give you the accuracy against a human-created categorization to tell you how accurate it's going to be. And it's extremely hard to get beyond 80%. Because, as I say, once you get to that, it starts to become very subjective. Whether something is a tweet about needing help or a tweet about asking for urgent help, it just becomes too grey. But it is something we're excited in building. And the assisted learning on that is something we're actively working on in a way that you don't need to be the PhD to be able to start to. You just need relevant data that you can start to train with. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you've had a good couple of days, and thanks for sticking around to the end. Thanks.